all wins and losses are not created equal. There are ways to drum up a fancy record to make it look like a fighter is special. A fighter's greatness can't be solely measured by their record. The same can be said when thinking a fighter with several losses on their record isn't great. Be that as it may, there was once a man from Denver, Colorado. He stood 6'3.5" with an 80.5-inch reach. He topped the scales at over 200 pounds at his heaviest. He had a strong build, though quite slender. This ultimately earned him the nickname the Colorado Giant. He was born Edward Martin on September 10, 1881. In a 1933 article, journalist Allen Pinky Ward recollected on the fighters of the 20 years prior, specifically between 1906 and 1914. He referred to this period as a time when fighting was less a business than a sport, when a variance of a few pounds in weight was not the subject of delays and quibbling, and when gates were as short as the bouts were fast. This was a time when the Bay Area was booming for boxing. Also a time of fierce competition in boxing's heavyweight division. Oakland would also be the adopted home of Denver Ed Martin, who ran a cigar shop until his death. Whether or not Martin chose boxing is still a question. What can't be understated is the fact that boxing chose him. There's a misconception that the sweet science of boxing was foreign to many boxing stars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While the sport has evolved over the last 100 plus years, an argument can be made that the skill set of boxers from those periods trump those of today, given that many of the past boxers had to deal with far more grueling conditions in boxing. They also fought often, sometimes too often. The perceived evolution has largely been improvements to make the sport safer. In the same 1933 article, then 55-year-old Denver Ed Martin stated the following regarding the state of boxing during that era. I'm not one of those old-timers who live in the past and think anything modern isn't so good. But when I look at the young fellows in the ring today, just wailing away with both hands, using no science and getting punchy before they've been in the game 5 years, it makes me ill. Martin also noted that not many boxers of that day used feints, though he did praise Benny Leonard, whom he referred to as having the feinting aspect down fairly pat. He also stated that Benny Leonard was a nice fighter and would do well against some of the boxers of Martin's time. Martin was a sizable heavyweight for his time and possessed a stiff punch that could get fighters out of there when he saw an opening. Martin noted his ability to thrust and how to throw the right punches at the proper distance. As a matter of fact, Martin credited himself for teaching former world heavyweight champion Jack Johnson some of these tricks in the ring. I saw Johnson playing around the gymnasium, recognized him as a real prospect, and showed him a lot of tricks. I gave him some pointers in boxing, how to drop a left to an opponent's jaw after the thrust had been blocked and was apparently harmless. Jack's ability with a short uppercut, a deadly punch and one seldom used nowadays with any degree of success, was partially the result of my instruction. Tooting my own horn? Not a bit. Merely a statement of fact that would be admitted by Johnson. Martin's aptness for the scientific side of boxing came the traditional way, through experiences in the ring. There was no shielding for Martin during his career, and he had to learn a number of these traits on the job, in real time, against the best of his era. This is a testament to his ability to absorb all these experiences and craft his game to his benefit, a true warrior mentality. A fighter rarely runs into his greatest rival in his first pro bout. This would be the case for Denver Ed Martin when on June 6, 1899, he stepped in the ring with the king of the Battle Royal, Bob Armstrong. The two men had nearly an identical build, with Armstrong being 6'4" with a 79-inch reach and a fighter who could weigh upwards of 200 pounds. On this night, at the Lenox Athletic Club in New York, both men tipped the scales at 190 pounds. After getting off to a good start in the first of a scheduled 20 rounds, Martin would take several huge shots in the latter part of the round as Armstrong took control, seemingly knocking the fight out of Martin. Armstrong would beat Martin across the ring in a second, knocking him out with a hard right, leaving him sprawled on the canvas. Though this wasn't the verdict Martin sought, it was less about the physical as much as it was about the experience. Bob Armstrong came into the contest with a record of 12 wins, 6 losses, and 6 draws. Like Martin, Armstrong didn't get any layups to start his career, having made his debut 5 years prior. Armstrong had fought for and won the Colored World Heavyweight title in 1896, a title he would hold for over a year. Armstrong had also taken on some of the best heavyweights of the era by this point, including former World Heavyweight Champion James J. Jeffries, former Colored World Heavyweight Champion Frank Childs, and Joe Chewinski. This setback would put Martin in line for a major comeback. Martin would fight 2 additional times in 1899, knocking out both opponents. On January 27, 1900, Martin would be in with another tough, battle-hardened heavyweight of the era in the self-proclaimed black heavyweight champion, Klondike John Haynes, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dubbed the Black Hercules, Haynes stood about 6 feet, weighing 200 pounds. Haynes had a tough career, starting 0-2 after twice being knocked out by Frank Childs. Martin would remain in the win column as he picked up a 6-round newspaper decision over Haynes. This led to another meeting with Bob Armstrong on March 23rd, where the two fought to what was considered a tame draw. This was only a precursor for their next matchup, with stakes at an all-time high. Before getting to that point, Martin went on what in hindsight was a very impressive run. This featured a July 17, 1901 contest with a now fairly obscure but tough and well-traveled heavyweight from the era, nicknamed the Black Eclipse of Bismarck, Denis Ike Hayes. In his career, Hayes, a former Montana State heavyweight champion, shared the ring with the likes of former world heavyweight title challenger Charlie Mitchell and former world heavyweight title claimant, the Irish giant Peter Marr. Hayes also notched an early career knockout victory over the tough fireman Jim Flynn. On this night, though, Hayes would be beaten to a bloody mess within 2 rounds and failed to answer the bell for round 3 as Martin showed that his skill set coupled with his power was a force. On this same night, Martin would fight an exhibition against former world heavyweight title challenger, the Akron giant Gus Ruhlin. Martin displayed clever boxing and shiftiness in his exhibition with Ruhlin and put many in attendance on notice. Billy Madden, Ruhlin's manager, noted that Martin was a heavyweight who was, quote-unquote, coming. Madden was a former bare-knuckle fighter who became a prominent 19th century boxing manager responsible for introducing the world to 2 of the most popular champions in history in former and first world heavyweight champion, the Boston Strongboy John L. Sullivan, and former world middleweight champion, Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, amongst other notables of the era. Seeing Denver Ed Martin as a promising fighter, Madden had brought Martin on board the Gus Ruhlin team in 1901, and the two hosted many traveling exhibitions. Martin would challenge anyone to stand with him for 2 rounds with $50 on the line if someone were able to last the duration. This was coupled with the fact that Ruhlin was eyeing a shot at James J. Jeffries' world heavyweight title, which would come later in November of 1901 after a scheduled February 15th match with Jeffries in Cincinnati, Ohio fell through when then Governor George K. Nash barred the contest. Partnering with Madden and Ruhlin offered Martin an opportunity to learn from a crafty contender in addition to a high level of popularity, as Ruhlin was well regarded throughout the heavyweight boxing scene. Next up for Martin would be an August 12th matchup against a journeyman and at times unapologetically dirty heavyweight Fred Russell, a 6'3" brawler from the era. In the 10th of a scheduled 20 rounds where Russell was completely outclassed, Martin dropped Russell with a hard shot. Russell used Martin to gain leverage while getting to his feet, then kneed Martin to the groin, resulting in an immediate disqualification. On October 2nd, Martin would need only 7 rounds to knock out the underrated, tough, and rugged Hank Griffin at Hazard's Pavilion in Los Angeles, California. The fight was scheduled for 20 rounds, but Martin showed his class in dominant fashion. With buzz at a high, Martin's manager, Billy Madden, on December 26th, released a statement letting it be known that he would be matching Martin with then colored world heavyweight champion Frank the Crafty Texan Childs in a bout set for February 14th, 1902 in Chicago, Illinois. Furthermore, Madden stated that he was ready to match Denver Ed Martin with any heavyweight in the world, excluding Gus Ruhlin. Madden also stated that he felt Denver Ed Martin would be champion and that if he defeated Frank Childs, he was ready to match Martin with then world heavyweight champion, the Boilermaker James J. Jeffries. Madden also stated that Jeffries might refuse the fight, thinking that Martin was not a draw. In response, Madden offered a $1,000 bet stating that he was certain that if Martin and Jeffries came together, the receipts would total more than $15,000. $1,000 was the equivalent of $35,477.79 in 2023, while $15,000 is the equivalent of $532,166.86. Coincidentally, Jeffries was at this same time being sued by former world welterweight and middleweight champion turned trainer Tommy Ryan for $1,000 in unpaid training fees stemming from Jeffries' training leading up to his first contest with former world heavyweight champion Gentleman James J. Corbett. January reporting stating that Jeffries had been in discussion with Tom Sharkey for a trilogy matchup in April of 1902 in San Francisco, California. In January of 1902, Madden received a letter from a prominent San Francisco promoter indicating that they were not interested in seeing Jeffries and Sharkey fighting in San Francisco, especially after Sharkey's controversial win over Bob Fitzsimmons in the city back in 1896. Interestingly enough, on January 28, 1902, in response to Billy Madden having deposited $1,000 in forfeit money for a matchup with Martin, Jeffries stated that he would possibly give Martin a chance if it was assured to him that Bob Fitzsimmons did not really want to face him. Jeffries also stated that he considered Martin one of the best heavyweights in the country and that he is a good and clever fellow that can hit a hard blow. He also stated that he is a glutton for punishment and he should be able to give any heavyweight a hard battle. There was reporting from the prior year that suggested that while Jeffries did not draw the color line strictly, he refused to fight a Negro for the World Heavyweight Championship. On February 12th, the Pastime Club of Portland, Oregon submitted an offer for $15,000 to match Jeffries and Martin in a 20-round contest. Additionally, in March of 1902, it was reported that Jeffries had stated that Denver Ed Martin would be his next opponent as the Tom Sharkey fight fell through. Jeffries also went on to state that Martin was a much better man than some people think and that he is well thought of in the East and if not defeated in the meantime, he would get a chance to box for the World Heavyweight Championship next fall. In response to the color line, Jeffries stated that his manager, Bill Delaney, was not in favor of him fighting colored men, but as to himself, he was willing to meet all comers, black and white. After the original date fell through, Denver Ed Martin and Frank Childs would meet on February 24th, 1902. Scheduled for 6 rounds, Martin would be in top form as he wreaked havoc on Childs' face with stinging jabs. Anytime the shorter Childs tried to close the distance, he'd be repeatedly driven back with straight counters. Martin sent Childs to the canvas with a hard right cross in the 4th as he breezed to a well-received decision over the last 2 rounds. With the win, Denver Ed Martin became the new colored world heavyweight champion. On March 14th, Carson Davies, manager of Bob Armstrong, sent a telegram to Billy Madden stating that England was the perfect fight location for 50 gross in response to a previous communication. The intended date was April 11th. The date would pass, though Martin would in fact head to England. On April 23rd, Gus Ruhlin and the Fighting Sailor Tom Sharkey agreed to a London clash set for the week of June 25th. The two men were offered $5,000 in purses and $1,000 in expenses, and another $5,000 as a side bet. Sharkey was accompanied by former world welterweight title challenger Tommy West and Bob Armstrong. As expected, Denver Ed Martin accompanied Gus Ruhlin. Given the dynamic, the plan was to match Martin with Armstrong while in London. Billy Madden and Denver Ed Martin departed for London on May 10th. On June 25th, 1902, Martin met the tough John Big Sandy Ferguson at the National Sporting Club at Covert Garden in a 15-rounder. In a fight that was considered hot, exciting, and clever, it was reported that Martin showed greater power and aggressiveness. Ferguson was worn out in the 5th and got reckless before Martin dropped him with a hard right hook to the jaw. A groggy Ferguson made it to his feet and started to fight gamely, but was dropped 3 additional times in the round before the referee stopped the fight, handing Martin the emphatic victory. This led to a trilogy match with Bob Armstrong a month later on July 25th in Crystal Palace. This time, the colored world heavyweight title would be at stake, with Martin defending. The bout in itself attracted a crowd, with 22,000 seats being arranged for the contest. Armstrong started off well, but Martin took over and proved to be the far more clever boxer as he cruised to a 15-round points decision with the verdict never in question. With the victory, it was also announced that Martin would challenge the winner of the return bout between World Heavyweight Champion James J. Jeffries and Bob Fitzsimmons, which took place the same night back in the United States. Jeffries would be victorious, knocking out Fitzsimmons in 8 rounds. Martin would bring his English tour to a close with back-to-back contests with former colored world middleweight champion, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, Frank Craig, in Newcastle on August 16th and August 30th. Both contests were scheduled for 10 rounds, with Martin agreeing that he would knock Craig out within the round limit in each contest. Martin would make good on his projection, knocking Craig out in 3 rounds in the first bout and 4 in the second. In the aftermath of the UK tour, Billy Madden was overwhelmed with excitement as it related to Denver Ed Martin, stating, "There are no fouls on Martin. Even if I say so myself, he's the cleverest Negro pugilist in the world, not even overlooking the great Peter Jackson. Since I took hold of Martin, he has developed into a wonder. He knows how to punch, is game, and is up to date." Martin would stay on a roll, as on December 10th, 1902, it would be a 4th meeting between him and Bob Armstrong, this time in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Both fighters would hit the canvas multiple times in the contest, but Denver Ed Martin picked up the 6-round decision, as Armstrong was barely hanging on for most rounds. A fight between Denver Ed Martin and world heavyweight champion James J. Jeffries hadn't materialized to this point. In December of 1902, Martin and team would reach an agreement to face another legendary fighter from the time and the man who would go on to become the first black world heavyweight champion in boxing history, the Galveston Giant Jack Johnson. Johnson, though early in his career, was making strides and was viewed as a legitimate threat for all of the top heavyweights. The two fighters would meet on February 5th, 1903 at Hazard's Pavilion in Los Angeles in a highly anticipated match. The colored world heavyweight title was on the line, and it would be Johnson who opened as the 10-8 favorite. There was also reporting that suggested Martin was the 10-6 favorite when the two men entered the ring that night. What commenced was one of the most terrific and talked about fights of the time. Martin had Gus Ruhlin and Billy Madden in his corner as seconds, while Johnson's corner was run by Martin Shaughnessy, Watson Burns, and the former world welterweight champion Barbados Joe Walcott. Martin was 203 pounds, while Johnson was around 20 pounds lighter. Scheduled for 20, Martin would do the leading through the first 10 rounds of the contest and was able to hold his own well, using his long left to land flush on Johnson's face and mouth. Martin also showed clever footwork, but Johnson's defense was considered invulnerable. From the 10th round forward, Johnson became aggressive and took full control of the fight as Martin started to tire. In the 11th, Johnson dropped Martin 4 times and nearly had Martin out, though he was saved by the bell. Martin was able to get back to stable footing around the 14th round, though he ultimately couldn't match the offensive prowess of Johnson. In the end, Johnson would win the 20-round decision and be crowned the new colored world heavyweight champion. Martin came into the contest with 15 victories, 1 loss, and 1 draw, and this would be his first loss since his debut fight, bringing a close to an impressive unbeaten run. Thomas Jefferson McCarey, a prominent boxing promoter from the time, recalled in a 1925 interview that the greatest fight he'd ever witnessed was the Denver Ed Martin and Jack Johnson contest from that fateful night in February of 1903. McCarey also stated that there was no fight he had ever saw that could match the contest, and that no other heavyweight in the world would have been able to defeat either man on that night. Some fights can take a lot out of a boxer, and in the case of Martin, this marked a shift in his career. From here forward, it would be a perpetual uphill battle as his competition level did not decline. On June 10th, Martin would meet Bob Armstrong for the 5th and final time in their fight series. Armstrong would right the ship after bombing back from an offensive onslaught in the 3rd round, landing a hard left to the stomach that sent Martin down for the count as he picked up the KO victory. The fight had been delayed the previous round after a brawl broke out ringside involving Big Sandy Ferguson, sports writer Rob Roy Benton, and the manager of the Detroit Tigers, Frank Dwyer. Martin's next contest would be against a then 7-1 heavyweight who would go on to be one of the greatest heavyweights in boxing history in the Oxnard Cyclone, Sam McVey. The fight took place on September 15, 1903 in Los Angeles. Martin would bump his skid to 3 fights as when in close, McVey landed a series of hard, short rights to the solar plexus that sent Martin down and out for the count as McVey picked up the first round knockout. In 8 months, Martin had gone from the most promising heavyweight in the sport of boxing to a man with a questionable future in the sport. Even his manager, Billy Madden, stated that he felt that McVey was the better man between the pair. Meanwhile, Jack Johnson was now being considered the future of the heavyweight division. Martin would sit on the sidelines for nearly a year when on August 12, 1904, Martin and Sam McVey would rematch. Billy Madden felt confident that Martin would be in form in this contest. The fight took place in Los Angeles at the same location as their previous fight. Madden's claim held true as Martin would put on a boxing clinic and at points made McVey look like a novice, showing a level of cleverness that had garnered Martin praise throughout his career. Martin would pick up the 10-round points victory. Martin would not get much of a reprieve, as at the same location on October 18th, he stepped back in the ring with Jack Johnson for a return bout. The fight started at a fast pace, with Martin pressing the action on Johnson. When inside, Johnson would repeatedly land hard shots to the body that forced Martin to a knee twice in the first round. Martin started the second with a hard left to Johnson's face, but received a hard right to the chest that sent him down for a 7 count. Martin went up to his feet, rushed Johnson, and was again dropped with a left hook to the stomach. Martin again got up at the count of 6 before a right hook to the stomach, followed by a left to the jaw, sent him down and out for the count. The bout was scheduled for 20 rounds. It was reported that Johnson was aggressive and very offensive in this contest, which hadn't been true for some of his previous fights. This was because he wanted to show that he was primed and ready to challenge heavyweight champion James J. Jeffries. Additionally, TJ McCarey guaranteed a purse of $15,000 to have the two matched at the Century Club. The public was now clamoring for a matchup between Johnson and Jeffries. As it related to Jeffries' response towards the fight, his stance towards facing black fighters had somehow shifted. Jeffries now drew a strong color line. On October 22nd, 1904, there were quotes from the night prior where Jeffries stated, "I do not care whether Johnson licks the Japanese army. I have repeatedly declared that as long as I'm in the fighting business, I will never make a match with a black man. The Negroes may come and the Negroes may go, and some of the Negroes may be excellent fighting men. Just tell the public that James J. Jeffries has made up his mind that he will never put on boxing gloves to give battle to an Ethiopian." Furthermore, in November of the same year, when responding to reports that he and Johnson were going to fight, Jeffries stated, "The story that I have agreed to fight Jack Johnson is not true. I will never fight a Negro. I am entirely in the hands of the press and the people. Any white man they choose, I will fight on 6 weeks' notice. Unless this is done before a great while, I will retire from the ring and be the only retired champion." With no further white men to face, on May 19, 1905, Jeffries officially announced his retirement, remarking, "Understand, I am not physically down and out, simply full of malaria and rheumatism, but I have decided to retire from the prize ring. I have 2 reasons for taking this course. My present physical condition is one, and the other is because there seems to be no one in sight to meet me capable of giving the public a run for its money." Whether the sudden change of stance on fighting Martin was done out of fear of a loss, I can't attest to. What we can all attest to is that Jeffries refused to fight the 2 best black heavyweights at the height of this prime, both Jack Johnson and Denver Ed Martin. There were conflicting records suggesting that Martin and Frank Chow fought a rematch in November of 1904. This fight couldn't be substantiated. Martin would be away from the ring for a while, or at least in a public fight, though he was the main sparring partner for Jack Johnson in early 1905 during Johnson's preparation for former world heavyweight champion Marvin Hart. On January 16, 1906, Denver Ed Martin arrived in San Diego in preparation for a matchup with Sam McVey. Martin worked out in front of a large crowd at the National Athletic Club. It was reported that Denver Ed Martin was, without a doubt, the most clever big man ever to step foot in the ring. It was also stated that well-known boxing authorities considered Denver Ed Martin to be far more clever than former world heavyweight champion James J. Corbett ever was, and that those who had witnessed Corbett would know exactly what that means. This further added to the legend of Martin, backing his claim as arguably the most underrated heavyweight in boxing history. Martin and Sam McVey would meet on January 25th at the National Athletic Club for a 20-round trilogy match. Much like the previous contest, the fight was fierce. Both men were landing hard shots during exchanges. McVey sent Martin to the canvas twice in the first round, with Martin taking the count to the last second. In the third, Martin and McVey came together with such viciousness and force that McVey was knocked out of the ring while Martin was simultaneously laid flat on his back. Martin had the better of the last bit of the round, nearly landing a knockout blow, though McVey was saved by the bell. Both men fought viciously in the fourth before McVey landed a left with the full force of his body behind it near the closing seconds, sending Martin down and out for the count. The two would be back in the ring on February 28, 1907, in Sacramento, California. This would be the fourth and final fight of their rivalry. Scheduled for 20 rounds, Martin would be leading the entire way until being stopped in the 16th round. This would bring a close to the rivalry and the hopes of Martin again getting a serious shake at the World Heavyweight title. On August 10, 1908, Martin would knock out the strong Victor McLaughlin in 3 rounds, again getting rave reviews for his cleverness and class as a fighter. On July 16, 1909, Martin met then upstart Ed Gumboat Smith in Seattle, Washington. Scheduled for 4 rounds, Martin would win the decision. From this point, Martin would have an on and off affair with prize fighting. Martin would pick up some wins, though none as significant as the early portion of his career. He'd be knocked out in 2 rounds at the hand of Tom Cowler on March 7, 1914. Martin would retire after a 1916 win before making a comeback in 1921, picking up wins over Tiny Jim Herman and Sergeant Ray Smith in September and October, respectively. The final fight of Martin's career would be a test against a heavyweight who, at the time, was considered the best heavyweight in the world by many, the Black Panther, Harry Wills. The fight took place on November 19th. Martin would be floored 6 times in the first round, with the last being a right to the ear that sent him down and out. This was a nod to an old great and a respect to Father Time. Denver Ed Martin knew it was time to call it a career. Martin finished his career with a record of 23 victories, 10 losses, 3 draws. 17 of his victories were by knockout. He also had 4 no-decision bouts, as well as 1 no contest. Much like many fighters of the time, the number was likely far greater. As time has passed, many great fighters from the 19th and early 20th centuries have been forgotten, save for the sport's big names. Denver Ed Martin falls into this category of forgotten fighters. In researching his career, many things have been revealed, but the most significant is that Martin was at one point viewed as the most clever heavyweight in the world and undoubtedly a legitimate threat to James J. Jeffries. This was recalled during his career, but far beyond his fighting days, he was still a fighter that many regarded for his absolute skill in the ring. Denver Ed Martin died on March 11, 1937. He left a legacy amongst the fighting men of his time that puts him in a class few were able to reach. While he may be gone, we are now in a technological age that ensures his accolades will no longer be forgotten. And for those who previously hadn't noticed, the time is certainly now. In a 1941 interview, Jack Johnson, in recalling the greatest heavyweights from his time, stated, "Bob Armstrong and Denver Ed Martin were 2 of the cleverest heavyweights ever to step in the ring. And Martin would have gone places, but he had a glass jaw." These words were spoken by one of boxing's most recognized heavyweights in history, and a man who knew what it was like to be in the ring with the greatest heavyweights of his era. Godspeed from Denver and beyond. Jesus Christ.